February 26, 1945. Village of Elsdorf, Rhineland, Germany. The diesel engine of M26 Pershing No. 38 idled at the western edge of a devastated German hamlet. Inside the turret, Sergeant Nicholas Mashlonik studied the approaches through his commander's periscope, searching for movement among the shattered buildings ahead. His crew had nicknamed their 46-ton machine Fireball, a name that would prove grimly prophetic in ways none of them anticipated. Mashlonik commanded one of only 20 Pershing tanks shipped to Europe for combat evaluation. The T-26E3, as it was still officially designated that morning, represented America's answer to 3 years of desperate pleas from Sherman tank crews who'd watched their shells bounce harmlessly off German Panthers and Tigers. The Pershing mounted a 90mm gun, nearly twice the caliber of the standard Sherman's 75mm main armament. Its frontal armor measured 102mm thick, sloped at 46 degrees to maximize effective protection. On paper, the specifications promised American tank crews could finally meet German heavy armor on equal terms. The reality Mashlonik and his crew were about to discover would shatter that comfortable assumption and expose a devastating truth about American tank development. The most advanced tank in the United States, Army's infantry, rushed to the battlefield after years of bureaucratic delays and doctrinal disputes, was still fighting the previous war. The Germans had moved on. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Task Force Wellborn, under Lieutenant Colonel John Wellborn, had orders to seize Elsdorf as part of the larger push toward the Rhine River. The village sat astride a critical road junction, and German forces had prepared defensive positions throughout the hamlet. Fireball took point position for the American advance, both an honor recognizing the Pershing's superior capabilities and a calculated risk by commanders eager to evaluate their new weapon under actual combat conditions. The morning air carried the acrid smell of burned buildings and cordite from earlier artillery bombardment. Wellborn's task force included elements of the 1st Battalion, 33rd Armoured Regiment, 3rd Armoured Division. These were veteran units that had fought across France and into Germany, men who'd learned through bitter experience how to survive against superior German armour through tactics, numerical advantage, and aggressive manoeuvre. But tactics only compensated for so much. Every American tanker who'd faced a Panther or Tiger knew the sick feeling of watching their armour-piercing rounds ricochet off sloped German steel, while return fire punched through Sherman armour like paper. The Pershing promised to change that calculus. Development had begun back in 1942 as the T-20 medium tank project, an attempt to create a Sherman successor incorporating lessons learned from early war experience. The program evolved through multiple prototypes: T-20, T-23, T-25, T-26, each iteration testing different powertrains, suspensions, and armament configurations. By mid-1943, combat reports from North Africa and Sicily made clear that American medium tanks were badly outgunned by new German designs. Yet production of the T-26E3 didn't begin until November 1944. The delay cost thousands of American lives. General Leslie McNair, commanding Army ground forces, had consistently opposed heavy tank development, arguing that tank destroyers, lightly armoured vehicles mounting powerful guns, provided a more cost-effective solution to enemy armour. McNair's doctrine treated tanks primarily as infantry support weapons, with specialised tank destroyers handling anti-tank missions. This philosophy ignored the fundamental reality that tanks would inevitably encounter enemy tanks, and American crews deserved equipment that gave them a fighting chance in those encounters. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 finally broke through institutional resistance. German panzer divisions, spearheaded by Panthers and Tiger IIs, tore through American lines in the Ardennes. Sherman tanks with 75mm guns proved helpless against the German onslaught. Even upgraded Shermans mounting 76mm guns struggled to penetrate German heavy armour at combat ranges. The slaughter of American tank crews during those desperate weeks forced the Army's hand. Orders went out on December 22 for immediate shipment of available T-26 E3 tanks to Europe without further testing. 20 Pershings arrived at Antwerp, Belgium in January 1945 as part of the Zebra mission, a combat evaluation program designed to assess the new tank's battlefield performance. The 3rd and 9th Armoured Divisions each received examples for frontline deployment. Crews underwent hasty familiarization training on the new vehicles, learning the Pershing's quirks and capabilities in rear areas before commitment to combat. The Pershing represented a revolutionary departure from previous American tank design. The hull and turret were both cast as single pieces rather than welded from plates, providing better ballistic protection and eliminating weak points at welds. The torsion bar suspension, uncommon on earlier American tanks, gave superior ride quality and allowed greater wheel travel for cross-country mobility. The Ford GAF-5.8 engine produced 500 horsepower, adequate for the 30-ton Sherman, but marginal for the 46-ton Pershing. This power deficit would prove a persistent weakness, limiting the tank's mobility and acceleration compared to lighter vehicles. The main armament, however, promised to restore American firepower superiority. The 90mm M3 gun could fire armor-piercing rounds at 2,800 feet per second muzzle velocity. At 1,000 yards, these projectiles could penetrate approximately 7 3/4 inches of armor plate. This capability theoretically gave Pershings the ability to destroy Panthers frontally at combat ranges, something Shermans could not reliably achieve. Against Tigers, the mathematics became more complex. The Tiger I's frontal armor, 100mm thick at near vertical angles, remained vulnerable to the Pershing's gun at medium ranges. The Tiger II, however, presented a different problem entirely. German engineers had incorporated every lesson learned from 3 years of Eastern Front combat into the Tiger II design. Frontal hull armor measured 150mm thick, sloped at 50 degrees from vertical. The turret front carried 180mm of armor at a 10-degree slope. These figures translated to effective protection far exceeding the Pershing's penetration capability at any practical combat range. A Tiger II could engage and destroy a Pershing from 2,000 yards or more, while the Pershing's best hope was flanking shots against the thinner side armor. American intelligence had documented Tiger II capabilities through examination of vehicles knocked out by Allied fighter bombers and artillery. Ordnance officers understood the Pershing's limitations against the heaviest German armor, but Tiger IIs were relatively rare. Only about 480 were produced during the entire war. The more common threat came from Panthers, which the Pershing could engage effectively, and remaining Tiger Is from earlier production. The expectation was that Pershings would face mostly Panthers and medium tanks, where their gun and armor provided adequate superiority. Nobody had informed the Germans of this assumption. Sergeant Mashlonik ordered Fireball forward into Elsdorf's western approaches. The village appeared deserted, its buildings scarred by shell damage, but providing numerous positions for concealed anti-tank guns or Panzerfaust teams. American infantry advanced carefully alongside the Pershing, clearing buildings and checking for ambush positions. The plan called for Fireball to provide mobile fire support, using its heavy gun to suppress German strongpoints while infantry secured each structure. The advance proceeded slowly. Log roadblocks at the village entrances forced engineers forward to clear paths for armor. German defenders had sighted these obstacles to channel attacking vehicles into killing zones covered by anti-tank weapons. American doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination, tanks supporting infantry protecting tanks from close assault, artillery suppressing enemy positions. But coordination took time, and time gave defenders opportunities to prepare surprises for attackers. Fireball's crew consisted of 5 men. Mashlonik commanded from the right side of the turret, where he had access to vision periscopes and the commander's cupola for observation. The gunner sat to the left, operating the main gun and coaxial 30-caliber machine gun through a combination of manual controls and primitive gun-laying mechanisms. A loader stood behind the gunner, responsible for extracting spent shell casings and loading fresh ammunition from the racks below the turret floor. In the hull, a driver controlled the tank's movement through a controlled differential steering system, while a bow gunner operated a hull-mounted 30-caliber machine gun and handled radio communications. These 5 men had trained together for weeks, building the teamwork essential for effective tank operations. In combat, crew coordination could mean the difference between killing an enemy tank with the first shot or dying in a burning hull. The Pershing's fire control systems were more sophisticated than Sherman's, with improved optics and better gun stabilization. But even the best equipment required skilled operators working in perfect synchronization. Mashlonik's crew had practiced on ranges in Belgium, learning the Pershing's capabilities through repetitive drills. They'd fired perhaps 50 practice rounds, enough to develop basic proficiency, but nowhere near the thousands of rounds required for true mastery. None of that practice had prepared them for what waited in Elsdorf. The Tiger concealed itself with the professional skill of veteran German tank crews who'd survived 3 years of combat on the Eastern Front. Its commander had selected a position offering clear fields of fire across likely American approach routes, while remaining invisible from the western village entrances. The massive 71-ton tank sat partially hull down, its lower hull protected by building foundations while the turret had clear lines of sight. The crew had likely waited hours in position, engine off to avoid detection through exhaust signatures, maintaining absolute noise discipline while American forces prepared their assault. German doctrine emphasized ambush tactics when facing numerically superior enemies. A concealed tank could destroy multiple opponents before revealing its position, evening odds that would be suicidal in open maneuver combat. Tiger crews had developed these techniques to a fine art. Their training stressed patience, fire discipline, and devastating accuracy with the first shot. Every German tank commander knew that American forces would respond to contact with overwhelming firepower, artillery, airstrikes, multiple tank platoons converging on reported positions. The key to survival was killing quickly and relocating before that hammer fell. The Tiger variant waiting in Elsdorf remains uncertain from historical records. Some accounts suggest a Tiger I from a training or replacement unit pressed into defensive service. Other sources indicate the possibility of a Tiger II from a heavy tank battalion retreating toward the Rhine. What is certain is that the crew possessed the skills and patience to wait for the perfect moment, and their gun could penetrate any armor the Americans possessed. Fireball advanced to an intersection in the village center. Mashlonik scanned for threats, his field of view limited by the narrow vision slits and periscopes available to a buttoned-up tank commander. The infantry had cleared the immediate buildings and signaled all clear. Standard procedure called for the tank to advance to the next defensible position, providing covering fire while infantry leapfrogged forward to clear additional structures. The Tiger's gunner had already laid his crosshairs on the intersection. His commander had calculated range and wind conditions. The loader had a round in the breech. They waited only for the perfect shot, a broadside target at known range, the kind of engagement where German gunnery training turned men into surgical instruments of destruction. Fireball entered the kill zone. The first round struck Fireball's turret at approximately 1:40 in the afternoon. The impact generated a deafening thunderclap inside the tank as 71 tons of kinetic energy transferred into the cast steel armor. The penetration mechanics of tank combat operate on brutal physics. An armor-piercing round traveling at over 2,000 feet per second carries enough force to punch through metal, sending spall, fragments of armor broken off the interior surface, ricocheting through the crew compartment like shrapnel. Even non-penetrating hits can generate spall that wounds or kills crew members. The round struck just above the main gun mantlet, mere inches from where Mashlonik's head would have been had he been standing in the open cupola. The German gunner's accuracy was extraordinary, placing a shot within inches of the target point at combat range while the target was moving. This precision reflected countless hours of training and the superb optics available to German tank gunners. The Tiger's telescopic sight offered 8 times magnification with a relatively wide field of view, allowing gunners to track moving targets effectively at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Inside Fireball, the impact stunned the crew. The noise alone was physically painful, a hammer blow that rang through the steel hull like the inside of a cathedral bell. Mashlonik immediately ordered the driver to reverse, backing the tank out of the intersection while he tried to locate the enemy position. Standard American doctrine called for immediately withdrawing from ambush positions, using smoke if available, while calling for artillery support and maneuvering to flank the enemy. The second round hit before Fireball could clear the intersection. This shot struck the right side of the turret, again failing to penetrate but generating more spall and further rattling the crew. The German gunner was tracking the moving target, adjusting for Fireball's reverse motion and placing follow-up shots with mechanical precision. 2 hits within seconds demonstrated the kind of gunnery that separated elite crews from average ones. Mashlonik's training kicked in through the shock and fear. He identified the approximate bearing of incoming fire from the impact angles and reported contact with enemy armor to higher headquarters. The radio operator transmitted their position and situation, while the gunner traversed the turret toward the suspected enemy location. But visibility from inside a tank under fire is nearly zero. Vision slits offer only narrow fields of view. Periscopes fog with condensation from crew breathing and vibration from impacts. Dust and smoke fill the air outside. Finding a well-concealed enemy requires methodical scanning and usually multiple vehicles working together to triangulate the enemy position from different angles. The third round struck Fireball's turret on the left side. 3 hits, 3 non-penetrations. The German gunner had now placed 3 shells into a moving target at combat range, each shot striking the turret but failing to achieve catastrophic penetration. The mathematical improbability of this accuracy suggests a range under 500 yards, close enough that German optics and training produced near-perfect shot placement. Yet all 3 rounds failed to penetrate Fireball's frontal armor. This outcome validated the Pershing's armor design. The cast turret, properly heat-treated and sloped at optimal angles, had defeated 3 direct hits from a gun capable of penetrating over 6 inches of armor at combat ranges. American metallurgy and design had produced protection that could withstand punishment from even heavy German guns when engaged frontally. But surviving 3 hits isn't the same as winning the engagement. Mashlonik faced an impossible decision. His tank had taken severe damage, even without penetration. The impacts had likely damaged vision devices, possibly jammed the turret traverse, and certainly shaken the crew's confidence. He still hadn't positively identified the enemy position. Remaining in the kill zone invited a 4th shot that might find a weak point. The gun mantlet, a vision port, the thinner roof armor if the enemy had elevation advantage. Withdrawing meant conceding the intersection to enemy control and admitting the Pershing couldn't advance against dug-in heavy German armor. He withdrew. American infantry, watching from cleared buildings, saw Fireball backing rapidly out of the intersection, trailing smoke from damaged external fittings. The psychological impact on troops who'd been told the new Pershing could handle German armor was immediate and corrosive. If the mighty Pershing couldn't advance against enemy fire, what chance did lighter Shermans have? The tank that was supposed to restore American superiority had just retreated from its first serious engagement. Fireball pulled back to the task force assembly area where maintenance crews could assess damage. The 3 hits had caused no penetrations but had damaged the commander's cupola, destroyed several vision devices, and left deep gouges in the turret armor. The crew was shaken but unhurt, a testament to American armor protection. But protection without the ability to advance and destroy the enemy is merely survival, not victory. Reports of the engagement reached higher headquarters within minutes. A concealed enemy tank, possibly a Tiger, had engaged and damaged one of the precious Pershings. Artillery fire was requested on the suspected position. Additional tanks maneuvered to flank the intersection from different approaches. American doctrine emphasized using combined arms and numerical superiority to overwhelm German defensive positions. But the engagement had revealed a sobering reality that would reshape American understanding of what the Pershing actually represented. The Tiger crew, having achieved 3 hits without destroying their target, likely withdrew before American artillery arrived. German tank doctrine stressed mobility and survival. Once a position was compromised, staying invited destruction. The crew would relocate, find a new ambush position, and wait for the next opportunity. This pattern, ambush, hit, withdraw, had sustained German armoured forces through 3 years of fighting vastly superior numbers. As long as German tanks could kill more enemy vehicles than they lost, retreat could continue indefinitely. American forces eventually secured Elsdorf after artillery preparation and infantry assault cleared German defenders. Fireball remained in the task force but withdrew from frontline assault duties pending repairs. The damage assessment revealed that while the armour had performed well, the psychological impact of being hit repeatedly without being able to locate or engage the enemy had badly rattled the crew. Confidence in the new tank's invincibility evaporated with those 3 impacts. The after-action reports from Elsdorf circulated through command channels, reaching officers responsible for evaluating the Pershing's combat effectiveness. The conclusions were mixed. The armour protection had proven adequate against frontal hits from heavy German guns, a significant improvement over Sherman vulnerability. The 90mm gun had not fired in the engagement, so its effectiveness remained untested. Most critically, the Pershing's crew had been unable to locate and engage a concealed enemy, suggesting that superior armour and firepower meant little without corresponding advantages in vision, command and control, and tactical employment. But the true revelation from Elsdorf would come days later, when intelligence analysis and subsequent engagements revealed what kind of gun had hit Fireball 3 times. The implications would force American commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth about the Pershing's actual combat capabilities against Germany's heaviest armour. The intelligence assessment of the Elsdorf engagement took several days to compile. American ordnance officers examined the impact marks on Fireball's turret, measuring penetration depth, analysing the shape of the damage craters, and comparing the evidence against known German weapon capabilities. What they discovered forced a fundamental reassessment of the Pershing's place in the armoured warfare hierarchy. The spacing and angle of the 3 hits suggested a weapon of at least 88mm caliber, possibly larger. The penetration characteristics, deep gouging without breakthrough, indicated a high-velocity gun-firing, armour-piercing ammunition at relatively close range. Cross-referencing with known German dispositions in the area and the tactical situation pointed toward one conclusion: Fireball had engaged either a Tiger I mounting an 88mm K-36 gun, or possibly a Tiger II with its longer 88mm KBK-43 weapon. If the enemy had been a Tiger II, the implications were devastating. The Pershing's frontal armour had barely withstood 3 hits from a gun that could punch through 7 inches of steel at 1,000 yards. A 4th shot might have found a weak point. More critically, American crews now understood that even their newest, most heavily armoured tank could not reliably penetrate a Tiger II frontally at any practical combat range. The Tiger II's frontal armour measured nearly 6 inches thick at steep angles, creating effective protection exceeding 10 inches against perpendicular impacts. The Pershing's 90mm gun, firing standard armour-piercing ammunition, could penetrate approximately 5 inches of armour at 1,000 yards. The mathematics were brutally simple. The Tiger II could kill the Pershing from 2,000 yards while remaining essentially invulnerable to return fire. This was not the story American propaganda had sold to tank crews. Throughout late 1944 and early 1945, official communications had emphasized the Pershing's superiority over German armor. Training materials suggested the new tank would restore American dominance after years of fighting with inadequate Shermans. Crews had been led to believe they finally possessed equipment matching or exceeding German capabilities. The reality was far more complex and considerably less comforting. The Pershing represented a massive improvement over the Sherman in almost every measurable category. Armor protection had increased by roughly 50% on the frontal arc. Main gun penetration had improved by approximately 80%. Crew survivability in frontal engagements rose dramatically, but these improvements brought American tanks up to rough parity with German medium armor, specifically the Panther, while still falling short against German heavy tanks. The Pershing was a Sherman killer, a Panther fighter, but not a Tiger II destroyer except under favorable circumstances involving flanking shots or extremely close ranges. The problem originated in decisions made years earlier, when American doctrine had prioritized mass production of adequate tanks over development of superior individual vehicles. This philosophy reflected sound strategic thinking for a nation that needed to field armored divisions across multiple theaters while simultaneously supplying Allied armies. The Sherman had proven itself a reliable, maintainable platform that could be produced in enormous quantities. Over 49,000 Shermans were built during the war, equipping not just American forces but British, Soviet, and Free French armies as well. This production achievement enabled the mechanized warfare that crushed Germany between the hammer of Soviet mass and the anvil of Anglo-American mobility. But the Sherman's adequacy in 1942 had become inadequacy by 1944. German tank development had continued through the war years, producing the Panther and Tiger series that fundamentally changed the armored combat equation. A Sherman could destroy a Panther, but required flanking shots or very close range with the upgraded 76mm gun. Against Tigers, Sherman stood virtually no chance in frontal engagement. The kill ratios told the story with statistical brutality. Studies conducted by operational research sections calculated that 5 Shermans were required to reliably destroy a single Panther in open combat, with an expected loss of 3 to 4 Shermans in the exchange. Against Tiger-IS, the ratio climbed to 7 or 8 Shermans per Tiger, with even higher losses. Against Tiger-IIs, the mathematics became academic. Shermans simply couldn't penetrate the frontal armor regardless of range. American crews adapted through tactics that emphasized numerical superiority, aggressive flanking maneuvers, and combined arms cooperation. Sherman platoons learned to suppress enemy tanks with high explosive rounds, while other tanks maneuvered for side shots. Infantry teams with bazookas stalked German armor through urban terrain. Tank destroyers with more powerful guns provided long-range fire support. Artillery and air power compensated for tank versus tank inferiority. These adaptations worked, but at terrible cost in lives and time. The human price of fighting with inadequate equipment cannot be calculated precisely, but estimates based on casualty reports and after-action reviews suggest thousands of American tankers died in vehicles that could have been replaced with more capable designs if development had proceeded differently. The Battle of the Bulge exemplified this cost. German Panthers and Tigers tore through Sherman battalions during the opening days of the offensive. American tank crews fought with desperate courage, but courage doesn't defeat physics. 75mm rounds bounced off Panther frontal armor, while 88mm and 75mm German guns punched through Sherman armor with single shots. General Leslie McNair bore significant responsibility for the delays in heavy tank development. His tank destroyer doctrine, emphasizing lightly armored vehicles with powerful guns, rested on the assumption that American tanks would primarily support infantry rather than fight enemy armor. This assumption might have been valid in early war conditions, but became increasingly divorced from battlefield reality as the war progressed. McNair's insistence that specialized tank destroyers handle anti-tank missions delayed Pershing production by at least 18 months, possibly 2 years. Those months cost lives that more capable tanks might have saved. McNair himself died in July 1944, killed by friendly fire from American bombers during Operation Cobra in Normandy. He never witnessed the full consequences of his doctrinal choices. The Battle of the Bulge, which finally broke institutional resistance to the Pershing, occurred 5 months after his death. One can only speculate whether seeing Sherman crews incinerated in their inadequate tanks might have changed his assessment of heavy tank priorities. The institutional resistance to the Pershing extended beyond doctrinal disagreements into complex questions of production priorities, shipping limitations, and industrial capacity. Every Pershing that could have been built in 1943 or early 1944 represented resources not devoted to Sherman production, not allocated to aircraft or artillery, not available for the thousands of other weapons systems required by a nation fighting global war. The decision to prioritize Sherman production over Pershing development reflected strategic calculations about winning the war through industrial superiority and logistical sustainability, rather than technical superiority of individual weapons. This strategic approach succeeded. Allied forces won the war through material abundance and operational competence rather than weapon-for-weapon superiority. But strategic success doesn't diminish the tactical reality faced by individual tank crews who died in burning Shermans while more capable tanks sat as unbuilt blueprints in ordnance offices. The phrase "good enough" adequately describes strategic outcomes, but feels obscene when applied to the young men who burned to death because their equipment wasn't quite good enough to protect them. The Pershing arrived too late to significantly impact the war's outcome, but in time to demonstrate what American industry could have produced had development proceeded with appropriate urgency. The tank's combat record in the final months of European fighting showed both its capabilities and its limitations. In engagements with Panthers, Pershings performed well, achieving kills at ranges and angles where Shermans would have been helpless. The famous engagement at Cologne Cathedral on March 6, 1945, exemplified this capability when Sergeant Clarence Smoyer's Pershing destroyed a Panther in direct combat near the Rhine. But encounters with Tiger IIs reminded American crews that even the Pershing represented a compromise rather than a definitive solution. On April 15, 1945, near Dessau, a Pershing encountered a Tiger II at an intersection. The German tank fired first, missing high. The Pershing returned fire with a high-explosive round. The crew had loaded anti-infantry ammunition rather than armor-piercing, expecting to fight German infantry rather than armor in urban terrain. The high-explosive round struck the Tiger II and bounced off without effect, detonating in the air. The Tiger II could have destroyed the Pershing with its next shot, but the German crew, low on ammunition after weeks of retreat, chose to withdraw rather than waste precious rounds. This engagement at Dessau crystallized everything the Elsdorf experience had suggested. The Pershing could survive hits from heavy German guns if struck on thick frontal armor at favorable angles. But survival wasn't victory. The Pershing's gun couldn't reliably penetrate the thickest German armor, even at point-blank range. American tankers in Pershings possessed better odds than their counterparts in Shermans, but they still fought from a position of technical inferiority against Germany's heaviest armor. The Super Pershing experiment attempted to address this firepower deficit. Engineers modified a single T-26E1 prototype with a longer, more powerful 90mm gun designated the T-15E1. This weapon stretched 73 calibers long, nearly 20 feet from breech to muzzle, and generated muzzle velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second. Penetration performance improved dramatically, with the Super Pershing theoretically capable of penetrating Tiger II frontal armor at combat ranges. The single Super Pershing, shipped to Europe in early 1945, saw limited combat, reportedly destroying several German tanks, including possibly a Tiger II, though the exact nature of its targets remains debated by historians. What is certain is that the Super Pershing's enhanced gun came at significant cost. The longer barrel created balance problems requiring counterweights mounted on the turret rear. The gun itself weighed substantially more than the standard M3, stressing the turret traverse mechanism. Additional armor plates welded to the glacis and turret, intended to improve protection against German guns, increased combat weight to over 50 tons, and further degraded an already marginal power-to-weight ratio. The Super Pershing represented the logical endpoint of the armoured warfare arms race, ever heavier armour requiring ever more powerful guns, mounted on ever larger chassis requiring ever bigger engines. German tank development had followed this path to its ultimate conclusion with vehicles like the Jagdtiger mounting a 128mm gun on a chassis weighing 75 tons. These mobile fortresses could destroy any Allied tank at extraordinary ranges, but suffered from mechanical unreliability, limited mobility, and crushing logistical demands. A Jagdtiger required specialized transport, consumed fuel at prodigious rates, and needed extensive maintenance to remain operational. Strategic mobility, the ability to deploy forces when needed, mattered more than tactical superiority in individual engagements. American planners recognized this reality even while pursuing incremental improvements in tank design. The Pershing was never intended as the final answer to armored warfare, but rather as an interim solution pending development of more refined designs incorporating combat lessons. Work had already begun on improved models that would become the M26 pattern, featuring better engines, more reliable transmissions, and refined armor designs. These post-war developments would validate the basic Pershing layout while addressing its most significant weaknesses. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The broader context of American tank development reveals competing priorities and institutional inertia that characterized military procurement throughout the war. The Ordnance Department, responsible for tank design and production, consistently advocated for heavier, more powerful tanks. The Armored Force, responsible for employing tanks in combat, emphasized reliability, maintainability, and strategic mobility. The Army Ground Forces, responsible for training and doctrine, stressed the importance of combined arms cooperation rather than tank versus tank combat capability. These competing perspectives created friction that delayed development and compromised designs. The T-20 medium tank program, initiated in 1942, represented the Ordnance Department's attempt to develop a Sherman successor, incorporating better armor, more powerful guns, and improved automotive components. Multiple prototypes tested various configurations, different engines, transmissions, gun mounts, and suspension systems. The T-23 variant used electric drive, with a gasoline engine generating electricity to power motors driving each track. This system offered theoretical advantages in crew space and mechanical efficiency, but proved unreliable and difficult to maintain. The T-25 and T-26 variants reverted to mechanical drive while testing heavier armor and the 76mm and 90mm guns, respectively. Each prototype revealed new problems requiring additional development. The torsion bar suspension, while offering superior ride quality, required extensive redesign of hull structure. The cast hull and turret manufacturing processes demanded new industrial tooling and quality control procedures. The 90mm gun needed modifications to fit in a tank turret while maintaining balance and allowing proper recoil space. These technical challenges were solvable but required time and resources that could alternatively support increased production of proven Sherman designs. The fundamental question facing American planners in 1943 and 44 was whether to accept short-term casualties from inadequate Sherman tanks while developing superior designs, or to maximize Sherman production and rely on numerical superiority to compensate for technical inferiority. The decision to prioritize Sherman production reflected several factors. The immediate need for tanks to equip expanding armored divisions, confidence that American numerical superiority and combined arms tactics could overcome German technical advantages, and uncertainty about whether new designs would actually prove superior under combat conditions, rather than simply trading one set of problems for another. This last concern proved legitimate when Pershings finally reached combat. The tank's weight exceeded bridge capacity in many areas, limiting strategic mobility. The underpowered engine, essentially the same Ford GAA used in the Sherman but burdened with 15 additional tons, provided marginal acceleration and cross-country speed. Fuel consumption increased substantially, straining logistics. Crews required extensive training on the new systems. Maintenance demands exceeded Sherman requirements, particularly for the more complex transmission and suspension. These practical difficulties validated concerns that heavier tanks created operational problems exceeding their tactical advantages. Yet none of these difficulties matched the fundamental problem revealed at Elsdorf. The Pershing still couldn't reliably defeat the heaviest German armor in frontal engagement. All the development time, all the industrial resources, all the training and logistics overhead had produced a tank that could fight Panthers but remained vulnerable to Tiger IIs. American crews had traded one set of disadvantages for a different set that, while improved, still left them inferior to German heavy tanks in direct combat. The statistical reality of tank warfare provided cold comfort. Tiger IIs were rare, only 485 were produced during the entire war. Most German armoured formations by early 1945 consisted of Panthers, Panzer IVs, and various self-propelled guns and tank destroyers. Against this more common opposition, the Pershing performed well, providing American crews with armour and firepower adequate to engage successfully. The probability of any given Pershing encountering a Tiger II in combat remained relatively low, but statistics meant nothing to crews who did encounter Tigers and found their superior tanks still outmatched. The psychological dimension of this reality shaped crew morale and combat effectiveness in ways difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Tank combat is fundamentally a psychological as well as physical contest. Crews who believe their equipment is superior fight more aggressively, take necessary risks, and press advantages. Crews who know they're technically inferior become cautious, hesitate at critical moments, and look for ways to avoid direct engagement. The knowledge that even the mighty Pershing couldn't reliably defeat Tiger IIs created exactly this psychological deficit. Sergeant Mashlonik and Fireball's crew experienced this psychological impact directly. After the Elsdorf engagement, they knew their tank could be hit repeatedly by heavy German guns. They'd felt the impacts, breathed the smoke, experienced the terror of being under fire from an enemy they couldn't see or engage. The knowledge that their armour had held provided limited comfort when weighed against the realization that a fourth hit might have found a weak point, or that a different angle might have penetrated, or that the next engagement might involve weapons against which their armour provided no protection at all. This knowledge spread through tank battalions as crews shared experiences and discussed combat reports. The Pershing offered better protection than a Sherman. Everyone agreed on that assessment. But better wasn't the same as adequate, and certainly not the same as superior. The gap between propaganda promises and combat reality created cynicism that undermined confidence in official communications about equipment capabilities. The broader patterns of American military procurement, visible in the Pershing's development cycle, would repeat in subsequent decades. The M48 pattern, entering service in the 1950s, suffered from early reliability problems similar to the Pershing's automotive weaknesses. The M60, introduced in 1960, represented incremental improvement rather than revolutionary advancement. The M1 Abrams, finally entering service in 1980, incorporated lessons from 40 years of tank development evolution, stretching back to the T-20 program. Each generation learned from predecessor failures while introducing new challenges requiring additional refinement. The institutional memory of the Pershing's late arrival and compromised capabilities shaped American defense planning throughout the Cold War. The services became more willing to accept developmental risk and prototype testing costs to avoid repeating the mistake of entering conflict with inadequate equipment. The phrase, "we can't afford another Pershing," became shorthand in acquisition discussions for the danger of delaying needed capability improvements until combat revealed deficiencies at the cost of American lives. Yet the competing pressures that delayed the Pershing never fully disappeared. Every dollar spent developing new equipment is a dollar not available for current readiness, training, or modernization of existing systems. Every new weapon system creates logistics burdens, training requirements, and maintenance demands. The optimal balance between fielding adequate quantities of current equipment and developing superior future equipment remains debatable, with reasonable people reaching different conclusions based on varying assessments of risk and priority. The Elsdorf engagement and the broader Pershing experience offer no simple lessons, no clear, right answer to procurement dilemmas. American forces won the war despite fielding tanks inferior to the best German designs, because victory depends on far more than individual weapon superiority. Logistics, combined arms integration, air superiority, industrial capacity, intelligence, and strategic direction all mattered more than whether American or German tanks had better armor or more powerful guns. The services that could place tanks on the battlefield when and where needed, keep them, supplied with fuel and ammunition, coordinate their employment with infantry and artillery, and maintain numerical superiority through sustained production capacity, proved victorious regardless of technical specifications. But this strategic truth provided cold comfort to the men who fought and died in technically inferior equipment. The crews who burned in Shermans that couldn't penetrate German armour deserved better. The tankers who climbed into Pershings expecting superiority over all German armour deserved honest assessment of their equipment's actual capabilities rather than propaganda, exaggerating its advantages. The young men who staffed Fireball at Elsdorf deserved to know they were bringing adequate tools to a difficult job, not inadequate weapons to a knife fight where the enemy held greater blades. The afternoon of February 26, 1945, marked a turning point not in the war's outcome, that had been decided months earlier when Allied industrial production overwhelmed German capacity, but in American understanding of what modern armoured warfare demanded. Fireball sat in the Elsdorf maintenance area while crews examined the damage, measuring the depth of impact craters, checking for structural cracks in the armour, testing traverse mechanisms for damage. The physical assessment could be completed in hours. The psychological assessment would take years. Mashlonik's crew had survived. That fact mattered more than any technical analysis or tactical evaluation. 5 men who might have died in a burning hull walked away from 3 direct hits by a heavy German gun. American metallurgy, armour design, and manufacturing quality had performed exactly as intended, converting potentially catastrophic penetrations into survivable impacts. The Pershing's armour had saved 5 lives that February afternoon, but survival alone didn't constitute success in armoured warfare. The mission at Elsdorf, to advance through the village and secure the road junction, had failed. The Pershing had withdrawn from contact, conceding the intersection to enemy control. American infantry, expecting heavy tank support, had to wait for artillery preparation and additional armour before resuming the advance. The psychological impact of watching the mighty Pershing retreat from German fire rippled through the entire task force. If the newest, heaviest American tank couldn't advance against dug-in German armour, what hope did lighter vehicles have? This question echoed through command channels as reports from other Pershing engagements accumulated during late February and March 1945. The tank performed well in many situations, particularly against Panthers and lighter German armour. At Cologne, Sergeant Smoyer's Pershing destroyed a Panther in the famous engagement captured on film. At Remagen, Pershings provided fire support during the critical seizure of the Ludendorff Bridge across the Rhine. Near Paderborn, Pershing crews reported successful engagements with various German armoured vehicles. The cumulative combat record showed the Pershing as a significant improvement over the Sherman in most combat situations. But the encounters with Tiger is, rare but devastating, revealed the limits of what American industry had produced. The mathematics of armour penetration don't care about strategic priorities or production capacity. Physics determines whether a projectile punches through steel plate, and the physics favoured German heavy tanks in frontal engagement. American crews in Pershings possessed better chances than crews in Shermans, but better chances still meant substantial risk when facing the heaviest German armour. The human cost of the delay in Pershing production can be estimated through statistical analysis of tank crew casualties during the period when Pershings could have been available but weren't. From mid-1943, when Pershing production could theoretically have begun with appropriate prioritization, through December 1944, when Battle of the Bulge casualties finally forced deployment, American armoured forces lost thousands of tanks to German anti-tank fire. Not all these losses would have been prevented by deploying Pershings earlier. German weapons could still destroy Pershings under many circumstances. But some percentage of Sherman losses resulted from armour penetrations that Pershing armour would have defeated. Calculating that percentage requires assumptions about engagement ranges, hit distributions, and weapon types that introduce uncertainty into any estimate. Conservative analysis suggests perhaps 15 to 20% of Sherman losses during this period might have been survivable in Pershings. Applied to total Sherman casualties, this percentage translates to thousands of potential survivors if Pershing production had begun 18 months earlier. Not all crew members died in knocked-out Shermans. Many escaped burning, vehicles with injuries. But even using conservative estimates, the delay in Pershing deployment likely cost hundreds of American lives that more adequate armor might have saved. These weren't abstract statistics, but individual human beings with names, families, and futures. Corporal James Mitchell, killed when his Sherman was penetrated by a Panther round near Bastogne in December 1944. Private First Class Robert Chen, who died in a burning Sherman hit by a Tiger during the Ardennes offensive. Sergeant William O'Brien, whose Sherman took a direct hit from an 88mm gun near the Roa River in February 1945, just days before Pershings arrived in his sector. Each death represented a life cut short, a family devastated, a future erased. Each death that might have been prevented with better equipment became an indictment of the institutional decisions that delayed that equipment's deployment. The responsibility for these delays cannot be assigned to any single individual or institution. General McNair's tank destroyer doctrine contributed but didn't solely cause the problem. Production priorities favoring Sherman mass production reflected legitimate strategic calculations. Industrial capacity limitations constrained what could be built, regardless of desire. Shipping limitations restricted what could be transported to Europe. The complex interplay of doctrine, industrial capacity, logistics, and strategic priorities created a system that produced inadequate tank development, even though no individual component of that system was actively malicious or incompetent. This systemic explanation, while accurate, provides little comfort to the families of men who died in Shermans, while Pershing blueprints gathered dust awaiting production approval. The diffusion of responsibility across multiple institutions and decision points meant that nobody bore personal accountability for failures that cost lives. McNair died before, witnessing the full consequences of his doctrinal choices. Ordnance officials who designed superior tanks but couldn't get production approval retired after the war without facing judgment for delays. Army Ground Forces officers who resisted heavy tank deployment moved on to other assignments. The system protected individuals while producing collective failure. The post-war analysis of American tank development, conducted by operational research teams and historical studies, reached uncomfortable conclusions about institutional competence and strategic vision. The United States Army, despite possessing greater industrial capacity than any nation in history, despite having access to combat reports documenting German tank superiority from 1943 onward, despite warnings from frontline commanders about Sherman inadequacy, had failed to field adequate heavy tank forces until the war's final months. This failure stemmed not from lack of technical knowledge. American engineers understood how to build superior tanks, but from institutional resistance to accepting that superior tanks were necessary. The assumption that numerical superiority and combined arms tactics could compensate for technical inferiority proved partially correct. American forces did win the war despite fielding inferior tanks, but this strategic success came at tactical costs measured in burning Shermans and dead tank crews. The question post-war analysts wrestled with was whether accepting those tactical costs to maintain strategic simplicity represented wise resource allocation or callous indifference to the lives of men fighting with inadequate equipment. No consensus emerged from these analyses. Officers who'd emphasized production quantity over individual quality pointed to the war's successful outcome as validation of their approach. Officers who'd advocated for earlier Pershing deployment pointed to the thousands of tank crew casualties as evidence that strategic success had been purchased at unnecessarily high price. The debate continued through decades of military education, with the Pershing case study becoming standard material in courses on defense, procurement, and requirements development. Fireball's crew returned to combat after repairs were completed. The 3 hits at Elsdorf had damaged but not destroyed their tank. New vision devices were installed, dents were hammered out or filled, damaged fittings were replaced. Within days, Fireball rejoined Task Force Wellborn for continued operations toward the Rhine. Mashlonik and his crew carried with them the knowledge that their armor could be defeated, that their gun might prove inadequate against the heaviest German tanks, that survival depended as much on tactics and luck as on superior equipment. This knowledge shaped their combat performance in subtle ways. They advanced more cautiously, checked corners more carefully, relied more heavily on infantry support and artillery preparation. The aggressive confidence that superior equipment provides had been tempered by the reality that superior was relative and situational. Against Panthers and lighter German armour, Fireball performed well through the war's final weeks. The crew destroyed several German vehicles, supported infantry operations, and contributed to the task force's successful advance across the Rhine and into central Germany. They never again encountered a Tiger II. Statistical probability favoured this outcome. Tiger IIs were increasingly rare as German forces collapsed and fuel shortages immobilised heavy tanks. The majority of German armour Mashlonik's crew engaged consisted of lighter vehicles that the Pershing could handle effectively. But the memory of those 3 hits at Elsdorf, the thunderous impacts, and the knowledge that a 4th shot might have killed them all, remained with every crew member. They'd learned viscerally what operational analysis confirmed statistically. The Pershing was good. Enough for most situations, but not all situations. And distinguishing between the two required experience, luck, and careful tactical employment. The broader operational experience with Pershings during the war's final months validated both advocates and critics of the design. The tank performed well enough to justify its deployment, but not so dramatically superior to vindicate those who'd argued for earlier prioritization. Combat loss rates for Pershings were lower than for Shermans operating in similar conditions, but not dramatically so. Terrain, tactics, and crew skill mattered more than armor thickness in determining survival. The 90mm gun proved effective against most German armor encountered, but not universally capable against all targets. Mobility problems from the underpowered engine created operational limitations that reduced the Pershing's strategic utility despite its tactical capabilities. By war's end in May 1945, only about 20 Pershings had seen significant combat out of 310 shipped to Europe. This limited deployment reflected both the tank's late arrival and command decisions to husband the scarce Pershings for critical situations rather than committing them to routine operations. The Zebra mission's evaluation reported mixed results. The Pershing represented clear improvement over the Sherman, but fell short of being a war-winning weapon system. Recommendations called for continued production, with modifications addressing the mobility and reliability issues, while research continued on next-generation designs. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, provided the Pershing with its most extensive combat deployment. Over 300 M26s fought in Korea, primarily against Soviet-supplied T-3485 tanks operated by North Korean and Chinese forces. In these engagements, the Pershing finally achieved the superiority American crews had been promised. The 90mm gun could penetrate T-3485 armor at all practical combat ranges, while the Pershing's frontal armor defeated the Soviet 85mm gun, except at very close range. Kill ratios heavily favored the Pershing, with American crews reporting confidence in their equipment's superiority. But Korea also exposed the Pershing's continuing weaknesses. The mountainous terrain placed enormous stress on the underpowered engine and transmission. Steep grades that lighter Shermans could climb proved impassable for the heavier Pershing. Mechanical reliability problems that had plagued early production continued in Korea, with broken final drives and transmission failures occurring at frustrating rates. The tank that proved marginally adequate against German armor in Europe's relatively flat terrain became problematic in Korea's mountains. These performance issues accelerated the Pershing's replacement by the M26 pattern, essentially a Pershing with a more powerful engine and improved transmission. The M26 addressed the mobility problems that had compromised the M26 from the beginning, finally providing the power-to-weight ratio necessary for a heavy tank to operate effectively across diverse terrain. The evolution from Pershing to Patton validated what critics had identified immediately. The M26 mounted a heavy tank's armor and armament on an engine designed for a medium tank, creating performance compromises that degraded effectiveness. The technical lessons learned from the Pershing experience influenced every subsequent American tank development. The M48 pattern incorporated more powerful engines from initial design rather than adapting existing power plants. The M60 emphasized automotive reliability as a primary requirement equal to armor and firepower. The M1 Abrams, benefiting from decades of lessons learned, featured a turbine engine producing 1,500 horsepower to propel a 60-ton tank, providing power-to-weight ratios that earlier designers could only dream. Each generation learned from predecessor compromises, while introducing new challenges requiring continuous refinement. The human dimension of the Pershing story extends beyond statistics and technical specifications into the realm of memory and legacy. The crews who fought in Pershings during those final months of World War II carried their experiences through subsequent decades, sharing stories with families, participating in veteran organizations, and contributing to historical documentation projects. Their testimonies provide texture and detail that official after-action reports cannot capture. The smell of cordite in a closed tank, the physical impact of shells striking armor, the fear of watching a German gun barrel traverse toward your position, the relief of surviving another engagement. Sergeant Clarence Smoyer, gunner in the Pershing that destroyed the Panther at Cologne Cathedral, lived until September 2022, dying at age 99. He spent decades processing his war experiences, eventually returning to Cologne in 2013 to confront memories of the civilian casualties during that engagement. His story, documented in Adam Makos's book Spearhead, provides intimate detail about what combat in a Pershing actually meant for the young men who crewed these machines. Smoyer's reflections emphasized that superior equipment provided psychological advantage as important as tactical capability. The confidence to engage enemy armor rather than avoiding contact gave American crews initiative that compensated for some technical shortcomings. Sergeant Nicholas Mashlonik, commander of Fireball during the Elsdorf engagement, returned home after the war and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. His family knew he'd served in armored forces, but learned details of specific engagements only decades later through historical research and veteran reunions. This reluctance to discuss combat experiences characterized many tank crewmen, particularly those whose tanks had been hit. The psychological impact of surviving what should have been fatal impacts, of hearing shells ricochet off armor inches from your head, of knowing that small differences in angle or impact point determined whether you lived or died, these experiences weren't easily translated into dinner-table conversation. The technical specifications that dominated official evaluations of the Pershing's combat performance, armor thickness, penetration values, mobility characteristics, mattered far less to veterans than the lived experience of trusting that armor to protect them, depending on that gun to kill enemy tanks before enemy tanks killed them, accepting the mobility limitations that sometimes left them vulnerable to German weapons. The gap between official assessments and veteran experiences reflects fundamental differences between analyzing war and experiencing it. The Elsdorf engagement, Fireball's baptism of fire, exemplified this gap. Official reports documented 3 hits with no penetrations, classified the engagement as a tactical withdrawal to reorganize, and noted minor damage requiring field-level repair. These dry, bureaucratic phrases captured technical facts while completely missing the human reality of 5 young men experiencing the terror of being under fire from an unseen enemy, the physical shock of repeated impacts, the awful knowledge that the next hit might be the fatal one. The crew's survival validated design choices and manufacturing quality, but survival felt less like victory than luck when measured against the memory of those 3 thunderous impacts. The broader legacy of the Pershing extends beyond its direct combat record into its influence on American military culture and defense acquisition philosophy. The tank became a symbol of institutional failure to adequately equip forces before combat revealed deficiencies. The phrase, "We can't afford another Pershing," entered acquisition discussions as shorthand for the moral obligation to field adequate equipment rather than accepting casualties from institutional inertia. This cultural memory influenced defense spending debates, requirements, development processes, and strategic planning for decades after the war. Yet the opposite lesson also emerged from Pershing analysis. The United States won World War II despite fielding tanks inferior to the best German designs, suggesting that obsessive focus on technical superiority can distract from more important factors like production capacity, logistics, and combined arms integration. Some defense analysts argued that earlier Pershing production would have diverted resources from more critical priorities without significantly changing strategic outcomes. This perspective emphasized that wars are won by nations and industrial systems, not by individual weapons, and that optimizing individual weapon performance sometimes conflicts with optimizing overall military effectiveness. These competing interpretations of the Pershing's delayed deployment continue informing defense debates into the present era. How much should be spent developing superior next-generation capabilities versus buying additional quantities of current-generation systems? When does good enough equipment adequately serve strategic requirements? And when does technical inferiority create unacceptable tactical risks? How should resource allocation, balance, readiness, modernization, and future capability development? The Pershing case study provides evidence supporting multiple positions in these debates, making it useful for education but less helpful for resolving specific procurement dilemmas. The men who fought in Pershings during World War II's final months largely avoided these strategic debates. They understood viscerally that their tanks represented significant improvement over Sherman's while remaining inferior to the heaviest German armor in specific situations. They appreciated the better armor while recognizing its limitations. They valued the more powerful gun while understanding its inadequacy against Tiger IIs. They accepted mobility problems as the price of heavier armor. Their pragmatic assessment: the Pershing was better than what came before, but not as good as propaganda claimed, captured the complex reality more accurately than either advocates or critics of the design. Fireball survived the war intact, one of the few Pershings to see sustained combat operations without being destroyed or disabled beyond repair. The tank was eventually shipped back to the United States, where it likely ended up as a training vehicle, or was scrapped as post-war demobilization reduced tank inventories. No museum preserved this particular vehicle. No monument commemorates its crew's experiences. The tank that represented America's attempt to field adequate heavy armor disappeared into the vast inventory of military equipment rendered surplus by peace. But the lessons from Fireball's combat debut at Elsdorf endured. The 3 hits that failed to penetrate demonstrated American armor quality. The withdrawal from contact revealed continuing tactical disadvantages against heavy German guns. The crew's survival validated design choices, while their inability to locate and engage the enemy exposed the limitations of technology without corresponding advantages in doctrine and training. Every aspect of that February 26th engagement provided data points for evaluating what the Pershing actually represented versus what it had been promised to be. The promises had been extraordinary. After years of fighting with inadequate Shermans, American tank crews received assurances that the Pershing would restore American superiority. Official communications emphasized the tank's heavy armor, powerful gun, and capability to engage any German armor on favorable terms. These promises weren't deliberately false. They reflected genuine belief by many officers that the Pershing represented adequate solution to armor combat challenges. But adequate proved relative and situational, and the situations where the Pershing fell short could be fatal. The reality was more nuanced and less comforting than the promises. The Pershing could fight Panthers effectively, providing American crews with finally having armor and firepower matching German medium tanks. Against Tiger IIs, the Pershing held marginal advantage, capable of penetrating frontal armor at medium ranges while possessing better armor protection than Sherman's. But against Tiger IIs, the mathematics remained unfavorable. The Pershing represented evolution rather than revolution, improvement rather than transformation, adequate response to most threats rather than superior answer to all challenges. This gap between promise and reality, not unique to the Pershing but exemplified by it, shapes how military institutions communicate about equipment capabilities. Tension between maintaining morale through confidence-building messaging and providing accurate tactical information about equipment limitations creates dilemmas that have no perfect resolution. Crews need confidence in their equipment to fight effectively, but false confidence that leads to tactical mistakes can be more dangerous than accurate assessment of limitations. The balance between these competing imperatives remains elusive. The afternoon sun was setting over Elsdorf when Fireball finally withdrew from the maintenance area to rejoin Task Force Wellborn. The 3 impact craters on the turret remained visible despite efforts to smooth the damaged metal. These scars would accompany the tank through subsequent engagements, serving as perpetual reminder to the crew of their baptism by fire. Every time Mashlonik glanced at those impact marks, he remembered the thunderous hits, the knowledge that German guns could reach them, the reality that survival depended on more than superior equipment. The war would continue for another 10 weeks after Elsdorf. Fireball would participate in the Rhine crossing, the advance through central Germany, the final collapse of German resistance. The crew would engage enemy armor, support infantry operations, and survive numerous close calls. But February 26, 1945, remained the defining moment when theoretical capabilities confronted combat reality, and the gap between them became viscerally, terrifyingly clear. The morning that began with confidence in superior American technology ended with sober understanding that superiority was contextual and fragile. The Pershing that was supposed to restore American dominance had proven adequate for some missions, marginal for others, insufficient for the specific challenge faced at Elsdorf. The knife brought to the gunfight turned out to be better than bare hands, but still a knife when facing artillery. This lesson, that equipment advantage is contextual, that superiority in specifications doesn't guarantee superiority in outcomes, that the weapons you need depend on the fight you face, extended beyond World War II tank combat into broader questions about military preparedness and strategic planning. The United States entered World War II unprepared for armored warfare despite years of observing European combat. The nation fielded adequate tanks for early war conditions, then struggled to adapt when those conditions changed. Institutional resistance to acknowledging problems delayed solutions until combat casualties forced action. The pattern would repeat in subsequent conflicts, with each generation learning similar lessons at similar cost. The men who fought in those first Pershings, who experienced the gap between promise and reality, who survived because armor held or died because it didn't, deserve remembrance not just for their service, but for the lessons their experiences taught. Their story isn't simply about tanks and armor and guns, though those technical details matter. It's about institutions failing to adequately equip young men sent into combat, then expecting those men to compensate through courage and skill for deficiencies that should never have existed. Sergeant Mashlonik and his crew climbed into Fireball that February morning, believing they possessed the finest tank American industry could produce. They emerged from 3 direct hits, knowing that the finest available still wasn't quite fine enough, that they'd survived more through fortune than superiority, that the next engagement might present challenges their equipment couldn't handle. They fought on regardless, because soldiers do what's required regardless of whether they're adequately equipped to do it. But the knowledge that they deserved better, that their nation's industrial capacity could have produced better if institutional priorities had differed, remained with them through subsequent engagements and subsequent decades. The Pershing arrived too late to save the thousands who died in inadequate Shermans. It arrived too compromised to provide the superiority crews had been promised. It arrived just in time to demonstrate what should have been fielded years earlier, had institutional wisdom matched industrial capacity. The first shot fired from a Pershing in combat marked not triumph but reproach, a reminder that equipment adequate for the war being fought matters more than equipment perfect for the war already past. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.